Okay, so welcome back to another video comparing Rossetti's poem to the play A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. Wanted to do a quick one on the poem From the Antique. I think this is one of the best poems to talk about the context of gender expectations. It was apparently completed in 1854, so she would have been around 24 or so at the time. And basically, it was never published in her lifetime. One thing that obviously people speculate is because it is so critical of the world, particularly of gender expectations. And this one, I suppose, is one of the best sort of images for the role of women, which works really well when you compare Ibsen and Rossetti. The fact that the title is From the Antique, and I find that interesting, it's sort of antique from the olden times. But we have this idea that it has always been this way. And of course, we see that in Ibsen's play as well, that these expectations have always been there. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going over this, just to pick out a few key things. The first thing is this idea of weariness. So essentially, I suppose, being worn out or tired. So it's a weary life. It is, she said, doubly blank in a woman's lot. We'll come back to the wish I were a man. And then if you get right down to the bottom, we then have that word, wake and weary and fall asleep. So kind of this idea of this sort of exhaustion with being alive. Oh, isn't it just so exhausting, being alive? So sort of being sick of the world, I suppose. And I suppose if you think weariness is sort of this idea of exhaustion, I suppose, I mean, not to the point of obviously falling asleep or being ill, but it reminds me of basically Christine, who has been working and as a result is sort of unrecognisable because she's aged due to how hard she's been working. And of course, these are middle-class ladies. That's an important thing to remember. And I think for if we're talking about Ibsen, but also Rossetti as well, Ibsen was very much a middle-class writer, writing about middle-class people for a middle-class audience. And Rossetti herself was very much in the middle classes. And the point with that is that unlike the working classes where women had always worked, the expectation was that women didn't. So for Christine, who has to and then chooses to, and Rossetti, Nora, who wants to work, this is seen as slightly unusual. And if you look at other women at this time in the sort of the mid 19th century onwards to the time the play was published, or in 1879, more and more opportunities for women to work were coming through at this point. So contextually, there's a lot to say about women and work, but just to make that point that we're talking about the middle classes here and not the working classes. But anyway, you then have lots of other images of sort of weariness in the play, which I think is quite key. And I think one of the ones is sort of Nora's weariness, as they use the image of the Christmas tree being kind of, the candles are a bit worn out. And, she's very much a symbol, or this Christmas tree is a symbol of her, I suppose. So when it appears in the second act and it's sort of burnt out and looking a bit rubbish. Oh my goodness, sorry about my thing. Symbol of Nora in Act 2. And then at the end of the play, when Torvald finds out that she's sort of been keeping the secret, he says to her, oh, you must be exhausted. And she said, yes, it's been a hard fight. And of course, she's sort of talking about keeping this whole secret and trying to prevent Krogstad from revealing it. But at the same time, I suppose it's a good image for her experience as a woman generally. Now, obviously, within this lovely line, doubly blank is in a woman's lot. So what women's kind of their share, I suppose, is it's much harder to be a woman. And I guess when you look at the women in the play, Christine, Nora, and as well Anne-Marie, the nanny. These women have all, in many ways, had to kind of fight for the men or the mistakes of the men in their lives and had to do it by themselves. Don't forget to talk about the sort of secondary characters, for example, like Anne-Marie, who had to give up her child so she could work, and the sort of exhaustion as a result and the relationship as a result. Now, this is the line which obviously I think is probably the one you want to talk about the most. I wish and wish I were a man. And there are lots of direct references to Nora's being a woman. I think Torvald calls her, hates her something like how like a woman, when she kind of like doesn't understand about the loan or the debt, sorry. And then he tells her, you've no experience of the world. As a bit of context, if you're not fully aware of it, I really recommend you looking up the two separate spheres. The professional, which was the male, and the domestic, the female. And of course, what I love about this play is that Nora is in the domestic sphere, she's a woman, but she wants to get to the professional one, whereas Christina, Linda, is in the professional sphere, but wants to break into the domestic, the female one. And that's best for me exemplified when Christina and Torvald are upstairs talking when the children turn up, and he says, oh, this is a mother's place, sorry. So they leave to try and find her somewhere to stay. So that works quite nicely. You've also got, of course, Nora's own fantastic line when she talks about having to work, and she says it was almost like being a man. It was quite fun. In Act 1, where she's telling Christine about how she made her money. So this idea that actually the role for women was very limited, and we'll see that obviously in those expectations. Now, what's I think particularly interesting about both this poem and also Rossetti's kind of point of view here is when she then says, or better than any being were not, nothing at all in all the world, not a body, not a soul, not so much a grain of dust or a drop of water from pole to pole. I'm sure you talked about the sort of the biblical, I guess, references of the sort of dust to dust, ashes to ashes thing, but also this idea of nothingness. And it reminds me very much of this image, the imagery of death in the play. When Nora is sort of like, when I'm gone from this world, you will be free. Now, of course, Nora is talking about death, but actually the image of kind of escaping and being nothing, no longer being alive, I think works. What another line of her, which I think is interesting, because she repeats it about 3 times to talk about different things. First to talk about the IOU, then to talk about the costumes, and then finally to talk about herself. And this is where she talks about tearing herself into pieces. And she, mentions, I think, millions of pieces at one point when she's talking about the loan. And this is when she has kind of realised that Torvald is not who she thought he was. And she's slightly horrified that she sort of had children with this man that she no longer understands, or she realises doesn't understand her. So this idea that actually this sort of destruction is preferable to the life that she has. Now, other than that, obviously the poem I think is fairly straightforward, talking about the sort of world around her without it. But again, the only thing I would just bring on in this last one is the none would miss me in the world. And for Nora, she talks about her children. And she asks Anne-Marie, in I think Act 2, how they would get on without her. And then at the end of the play, she says something along the lines of, in fact, I'll get it so I can find the exact thing she says. She says, I know they're in better hands than mine. She doesn't want to see them. So she feels she is able to leave the house because she knows that actually Anne-Marie is the nanny, and also that the staff of the house will do a better job because she herself hasn't actually been a particularly good mother and a particularly good, I don't know, wife, which was a sort of a role, a much more formal role at the time. So yes, some good similarities there, and I think it's one of those poems that you could say lots and lots of other things about it, but those I would say are the most interesting comparisons to draw.